Okay, welcome everyone. I see some folks are still streaming in, but I want to get us kicked off here so that we have ample time for the exciting discussion we have before us. Hi, my name is Josh Graf-Zivan. I know many of you, but not all of you here on the Zoom call. I am the director of the Center on Global Transformation here at UCSD. Many of you know the center. The center is a central hub for applied research and policy dialogue focused on the opportunities and challenges arising from global economic and technological change. The center supports a wide range of activities central to our mission, including the exciting work of the flagship research centers at the School of Global Policy and Strategy. That includes the Big Pixel Initiative, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology, and the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy, as well as a number of campus-wide research initiatives. For those of you that are not familiar with the center, much more information can be found at our website, cgt.ucsd.edu. As many of you know, the Pacific Leadership Fellows Program is at the core of the center's mission. The program brings thought leaders from business, policy, and academic communities around the globe for a brief residency at UC San Diego, during which time they provide public lectures and interact with faculty and students. To date, the program has hosted more than 100 fellows from 24 countries. As you also know, we're living in unusual times. So in light of the pandemic, we have put our Pacific Leadership Fellows program on hold, and we've replaced that program for the current year with a new series called Conversations for an Engaged San Diego. The event tonight is the second in that series, and we are delighted to welcome our own David Victor, as well as Jeff Sachs from Columbia University, to talk about the technological, economic, and policy steps required to address climate change in the US. Gordon McCord has generously agreed to serve as our moderator. Gordon currently serves as the Associate Dean for Student Affairs at GPS. He's also a senior advisor to the Sustainable Development Solutions Network for the United Nations and a leading expert on issues that lie at the intersection of development, economics, public health, and the environment. Before turning the microphone over to Gordon, who will introduce our speakers and get this event rolling, I would like to offer a special thanks to the center's founding supporters, Joan and Erwin Jacobs, whose continued generosity makes events like this possible. Welcome and thank you. Gordon, the microphone is all yours.
Thanks, Josh. Welcome, everybody. So it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers. First is world-renowned author, educator, and leader in sustainable development, Professor Jeffrey Sachs. He's a university professor at Columbia University, the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia. He's president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and has been special advisor to 3 UN Secretary Generals on the Sustainable Development Goals, Kofi Annan, Ban Ki-moon, and the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. And most importantly to me, he's been an incredibly generous mentor and friend for the last 20 years, and I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce him. Joining Jeff will be our own Professor David Victor from the School of Global Policy and Strategy. He's a professor of international relations. He is the Center for Global Transformation Endowed Chair in Innovation and Public Policy. He co-directs the campus-wide Deep Decarbonization Initiative at UC San Diego, and he's a tremendous leader in the energy policy space. He works with the Brookings Institution, the World Economic Forum, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So they're both world-renowned experts in these topics, and we're delighted to have you, so welcome to you both. Our format will be, I'll give about 12 minutes to each of our guests to give some initial thoughts, and then we can have a conversation, and I'll leave starting at about 15 minutes of questions from our audience. And I'd encourage audience members to use the Q&A feature here in Zoom to leave your questions so that I can pose them to the speakers later. So welcome to you both. And Jeff, let's start with you. Please go ahead.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Gordon. David, Josh, thanks to the Jacobs for making this series possible. I believe we'll meet later on, I hope. And thanks for the chance to have a good discussion of a crucial issue that will be very much in the forefront of our politics for years to come, but I think even in the first days of the new administration. It may be a good idea to start with yesterday, because yesterday, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres gave a global address calling on all nations to join a consortium to commit to net zero emissions by mid-century, and to do that specifically at next year's climate summit, which will be the occasion in November 2021 for all governments of the world to upgrade commitments that the governments made regarding climate change, first in the aftermath of the Paris Climate Agreement, which was 2015, and now 5 years later, delayed by COVID by a few months, but 5 years later, to enhance those commitments. And what Secretary General Guterres said was every country should commit to net zero, or sometimes just called decarbonization, or sometimes called climate neutrality by mid-century. Why that standard? That standard is based on the science summarized and collated by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which says that to meet the Paris Climate Agreement objective of holding global warming to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius by end of the century, we need to reach net zero emissions by mid-century. And it should be clear that that is to meet the goal with a 2/3 probability, because even if we do decarbonize by mid-century worldwide, there is still a significant chance that Earth will overshoot the 1.5 degree Celsius warming limit, or the target that we've set as the upper bound for warming. Why 1.5 degrees? Because it's already very, very dangerous. And a lot of climatology suggests that at a threshold like 1.5 degrees Celsius, not only would the shocks such as the forest fires that have been suffered terribly in the Pacific coast, or the extreme storms, the high intensity hurricanes, the floods and the droughts being experienced by our country, but all over the world, not only would all of those shocks be much worse, but we'd have the real possibility of breaching quite devastating thresholds or tipping points, not least of which is the disintegration of the significant part of the Antarctic ice sheet, which could lead to several meters rise of sea level, which would be catastrophic for a great part of the planet, including the small island economy that I live on called Manhattan, which would be devastated by a multi-meter sea level rise. So that's why we want to stay below 1.5 degrees C, but we're not doing much of a job, as everybody knows, in stopping the rise of emissions, much less pointing global emissions of greenhouse gases down to zero. And when the Secretary General spoke yesterday, he pointed out that the World Meteorological Organization, which helps to oversee the IPCC, had issued its update to the annual climate report, noting that 2020 will be within the 3 warmest years on record, probably second warmest after 2016. And that's despite a La Nina in the Pacific, which usually is a cooling phenomenon, meaning that when we switch back to El Nino, there's a real chance we're going to reach 1.4 degrees within years. We're already at 1.2 degrees C above pre-industrial now, and we're marching towards that threshold, that upper limit, at roughly 0.2 to 0.3 degrees C per decade right now. The long and the short of it is we're facing potential disaster. We've been at this for a long time. Donald Trump, as he did with everything, messed things up even worse. by pointing us in the wrong direction for several years, pulling the US out of the Paris Climate Agreement, making a general mess of things. And now President-elect Biden's going to have to pick up the pieces, help to convince Americans of many things. Wearing face masks will be one of them, and the other will be the need to make a decisive turn to decarbonization. When we do make that commitment, which I think Biden will make on the first day of office, to reach net zero by 2050 in some kind of proclamation or declaration of intent, we will be joining the European Union that has made that commitment, Japan that has made that commitment, Korea that has made that commitment, the United Kingdom that has made that commitment, and China, with President Xi's speech at the UN General Assembly, committed to net zero by 2060. And I want to nudge China as best we can to accelerate that to 2050. But in other words, the United States is going to be joining a large number of countries that have already put into law or put into national policy or both the determination to reach net zero. So just to conclude on these opening remarks, Gordon and David and I and colleagues from around the country worked this year on an initiative to ask, well, how would you do it? And we had wonderful help from Jim Williams, who's a professor at the University of San Francisco, and his modeling team, which did a formal analytical model of how one could use the existing knowledge of technologies and unit costs and likely pathways of those technologies to chart out, using a 16 region model of the United States and a lot of detail down to the kinds of refrigerators and air conditioners and certainly vehicles and industrial energy use, what kind of path could get us to net zero? And I'll just summarize very, very briefly, because the answer is similar in all countries that look at this question. We need essentially to have zero carbon or nearly zero carbon electricity, and we need to electrify everything we can. And for the things that we can't electrify, we need to use the zero carbon electricity through some kind of green chemistry, whether it's hydrolysis and water to produce hydrogen, or fancier techniques to produce synthetic liquids or synthetic methane or other synthetic fuel carriers like synthetic ammonia, to use that clean electricity to provide zero carbon fuels. The basic point, get electricity to zero, get automobiles to zero through our friendly Teslas and other electric vehicles, get our homes to zero through electrification of heating throughout the United States, and get our industry to zero either by electrification of processes or by introducing hydrogen fuel cells or other heat processes for industry using net zero carbon power. And there are some hard, puzzling sectors like aviation and ocean shipping where the pathways are not so clear, but there are a range of technology choices. And that's probably a good segue to David Victor, who is one of the great world specialists on technological change and integrating learning along a kind of path to net zero. And this is the point that David continued to emphasize throughout our project, how we make this a learning pathway as well as a determined, directed policy to get to net zero. So just a quick overview there, Gordon, and back to you.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. David, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Gordon, and thank you, Jeff. That was a terrific overview, both of the nature of the challenge and then what we did in this group of universities, including UC San Diego, as part of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network that you so ably led, and this report that came out in October, the Zero Carbon Action Plan. So 2020 has not, for the most part, been a year of good news, but I think actually on climate, there's a lot of good news that's now mobilizing. The UK government, which will host the next Conference of the Parties, COP26, as Jeff said, it'll be held next year, 1 year delay from the plan for this year because of the pandemic. They're now collecting pledges from different countries. The pledges are coming in, and there's a lot more, not just pledging, but serious plans behind that. Chinese plan, the Korean plan, we'll have a new Biden administration plan. The elements of it will be announced very quickly. And all of that I don't think it probably adds up to stopping warming at 1.5 degrees, but it adds up to a whole lot more progress than we saw even 5 years ago in Paris. And so that's really, really terrific. So I just want to pick up where Jeff left off and talk about some of the technological options. And in particular, I want to focus on electric power. I think electric power is the key to thinking about this. Pretty much every energy model agrees that an economy that decarbonizes is an economy that electrifies. And that's because it's easier to control emissions at a limited number of sources and then move the energy in clean form by wire to places where it is ultimately used. And the current plans, for the most part, are, as Jeff said, electrify as much as possible, and then make sure the electric power system has essentially zero emissions. It could well be that in the future we have other kinds of energy carriers that complement electricity. Hydrogen is a leading contender, where you in effect move energy in gaseous form or liquid form as hydrogen. So hydrogen itself is not a fuel, it's an energy carrier like electricity, and then you burn or use the hydrogen chemically. That looks very attractive. Right now, the costs are pretty high. The very first technical paper I ever wrote in graduate school was about hydrogen-powered aircraft, so I keep waiting for that to happen, but I'm not going to be the first guy on that plane. Maybe later, after some other people have been on the plane and we're sure that it's safe. The costs are really high, and that just leads everyone back to looking at electricity. Electricity is really essential here. Inside the United States, what's interesting about electricity is that this is mainly the province of the states. The policies that are driving the electric power sector. There's a federal role. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, will play a role. You're going to see very important appointments to FERC by the Biden administration right when they get into office. But this is mainly at the state level. And 10 states already in the United States have pledges to have essentially zero emissions from their electric power sector by mid-century, if not earlier. And another 10 or so are in the process of developing those kinds of pledges. So there's really quite a lot of momentum, even in the United States. And you're going to hear a lot about how the Biden administration doesn't have the votes in Congress to get possibly new legislation passed. But this is an area where the states can do quite a lot. And pretty much regardless of who's in the White House, that will stick and that'll be seen as credible in the rest of the world. So I think this is all very encouraging. And just one additional piece of encouragement, which is the electric power sector is the sector that's also seen the most progress in reducing emissions. Since 2000, the emissions from the electric power sector in the United States, controlling for the quantity of electricity we use, have gone down by about a third. The modeling work that's behind the ZCAP plan that Jeff was talking about, that Jim Williams led, envisions roughly doubling that speed of decline. So that's a heavy lift, difficult, but not impossible, such that over the next 2 decades, the electric power sector goes essentially to zero emissions. So pretty good news. Technology. One of the reasons that electric power is so interesting is there are a lot of different options for generating electricity at very low emissions. And as someone who studies the geography of technological change, to me, what's interesting is the technological frontier in electricity is no longer just in the traditional Western countries. It's all around the world. So India is now one of the frontier countries in deploying low-cost solar. including remote off-grid or partially off-grid solar. I spent a couple hours yesterday with a Colombian energy minister. They've been pioneering a whole set of new financial arrangements that have driven costs for renewables way down, such that Colombia is now one of the leaders in deploying renewables. It's not just renewables, it's also nuclear power. The most interesting nuclear power project in the world is a project being built right now in Abu Dhabi. If you land in Abu Dhabi and then drive about 3 hours towards the Saudi border, I was just inside the first reactor almost exactly a year ago. It's a gigantic Korean-built reactor that in that region, that's going to be one of the major ways that they generate low carbon or zero carbon electricity. And so there's a lot of technological frontier happening in the traditional centers of innovation, but there's also the rest of the world is participating. And I think that's going to be very good news. I do want to underscore that one of the things that's critical about the electric power sector from a policy point of view is that today the electric power sector has both capital costs and operating costs, fuel, natural gas, coal, and so on. The electric power system of the future that has zero emissions is going to be one that's all capital cost, essentially all capital cost. So that's going to raise all kinds of difficult questions about how we're going to charge for electricity, because frankly, the marginal cost of electricity will be zero. If you charge zero for electricity, then people will overconsume it, and we won't be able to generate the revenues needed for the power sector. So we're going to see, you're going to ultimately see this in your power bill, big changes in how people pay for things. We're also going to pay really close attention to the impact of all this on inequality, because for all else equal, a system that relies more on capital to generate outcomes is one that potentially could exacerbate the inequalities that we're seeing in the world today. Just a couple last points before we go to the open discussion. I want to just pick up, we had a lot of conversations in our group about what do we know and what don't we know. I want to emphasize that if you're really going to transform the energy system, there are a lot of unknowns, and you've got to build policy that is able to quickly go run experiments and learn rapidly which experiments work, which experiments don't work. And if we don't do that, we're going to be building white elephants in the desert. And so we actually know a lot about this. And to me, what's most striking about what we've learned is that this all requires government. This is a world where the private sector on its own isn't going to do it. Government on its own isn't going to do it. Government and business together are going to have to collaborate. They're going to have to learn to get along. Places where government is highly competent and qualified, able to learn rapidly, are the places that are going to do very well in deep decarbonization. And the last point I'd make is about leadership. We live here in California. We're thrilled with ourselves because we're leaders on climate change policy, as we should be thrilled with ourselves. But leadership, one of the great ironies about leadership and the climate change problem is that the more you do to control your own emissions, the less relevant to the overall problem you become, because your emissions shrink while the emissions of the rest of the world go up. And so the whole game here is not just leadership for leadership's sake. It's got to be followership. We've got to design strategies that are seen by the rest of the world as attractive, so that we don't just decarbonize in a way that is extremely expensive and then not replicable, but it has to be replicable in the rest of the world. We have to actively help the rest of the world follow those leader examples. And that's an area where I think California historically has done very well, whether it's pushing zero emission vehicles, electric vehicles out into the marketplace, whether it's integrating renewables onto the grid. But it's where we have to keep our eyes on the ball, because leadership for leadership's sake, gives you a good talking point at a cocktail party, nice things to say to other people in Davos, but it doesn't stop the global climate problem, which is ultimately caused by the global mixing of pollutant carbon dioxide and other pollutants that don't frankly care where they are emitted from, because they affect the climate across the entire planet. So let me stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thanks very much to you both. I'll pose a question just to trigger conversation, but also remind the audience to, as questions come to you, please post them in the Q&A so that I can call on those in about 20 minutes. So my first question, and both of you alluded to this, but it would be nice to unpack your thoughts. The ZCAP that we worked on presents an ambitious agenda for federal action to decarbonize the US. But we're not going to know until January whether the Democrats will win control of the Senate. And so there's a very high likelihood that we'll have a divided federal government. And so in your view, how might the Biden administration proceed with the decarbonization agenda in these two scenarios, one with and one without a democratically controlled Senate? Jeff, do you want to go first?
You're muted.
By the way, the most frequent sentence of the English language is "you're on mute," and after 9 months, I'm still doing it. So I was saying that for me, the question you ask is one of the great puzzles that I'm spending a lot of time thinking about. We cannot manage as a country on the razor-thin question of, do you have 50 votes plus a tiebreaker, or do you have 51, or do you have 49? We've been doing that for at least 10 years. We've been doing it for longer, in fact. Our country is in a downward spiral because the moment the election ends, we're on to the next election. And now, because of Trump, we don't even have an end to the election. We're just in non-stop campaigning and fighting. And who knows what's going to happen in the Georgia runoffs. But to my mind, first, we cannot survive by executive orders alone. We need to forge some kind of national consensus again. Now, this may be stupid and naive, because if one side doesn't play and everything is to wreck things until 2022 so the Republicans can retake the House in 2024 so that they can retake the White House, and then we work till 2028, and in the meantime, we never solve anything again, that is a possibility. And I've been at this for 40 years in public policy now. It's fair to say, just as an old guy, I've never seen anything like this in the United States before. We've always had rough and tumble politics, but this is beyond imagining, where you don't cross over party lines, where Mitch McConnell does or doesn't determine what goes to the Senate floor. The whole mindset is awful for us. So that's a little sermonette before getting to your question. I think we have to break this sense that this is a Democratic versus Republican issue. And I do want Biden to sign the executive order bringing us back into the Paris Climate Agreement, definitely. But another Republican president could take us out again, which would be awful. But I would like also some real effort this year, not at jamming something through in any event, but at actually just trying to have a rational discussion in our country about these issues. And Biden is the kind of person who can do that. He's a centrist Democrat and a nice man and a smart guy, and not hyper partisan. And he's been around a long time and knows all the other side and has voted with them a lot, and has brought them over on a number of issues over the years, until the last 10 years, which has been so polarized, we don't even consider that. At the state level, unlikely states are booming in renewables, and Texas is Exhibit A, I think, which has had a field day deploying wind power, and now is about to go into mega solar power the same way. And that's the center of our oil industry in this country. And so I think that we can find ways to create, if not a national consensus, at least a 55-45 or 60-40 break in favor of this issue. The reason being that every opinion survey shows 65 to 70% of Americans want a major investment in renewables. 65 to 70% of Americans say this is a real and serious issue. So we're not going against public opinion. And 65 or 70% of the states, at a minimum, could be active players in deploying the new energy or in building the new energy. So one of the things I'd like to join in with our general process is an industrial policy that says we're going to build a lot of what we need here in the United States. it's industrial policy, meaning we probably will have border limits on how much PV or wind turbines and others we're going to import from China. I don't think it's the worst thing in the world, actually, that we determine that we're going to build up our renewable industry in part as a conscious part of this strategy to win the heartland, to provide jobs, to get the technology leadership done for the security issues and so forth. In general, I like open trade, but I won't mind if we create a lot of jobs in clean industry in the United States in the next 10 to 15 years. And that could help to tip the balance politically as well. So all in all, I'd like us to think about political strategies to not have either executive orders or regulatory approaches to just try to squeeze by, but rather to take this to the country over the next 12 months and say, hey, this is good for America and it's good for your state too, and to try to win that case.
Yeah, I think a consensus is vitally important, and the facts on the ground are going to be helpful along the way because we are seeing the impacts of climate change. It's interesting, we did a study at Brookings about a year and a half ago where we overlaid the expected impacts of climate change on voting behavior. And the places that are most exposed, in particular to heat stress, are the places that have mostly voted for people who are not in favor of climate policy. So it could be that the facts on the ground will help a little bit there. And I agree completely with Jeff that we need to articulate climate in a way that it's not just abstract, but it's connected to jobs and industrial growth and so on. I want to just come back to politics, though, for a moment. I think we have to plan for divided government. Even if both the Georgia seats go to the Democrats, we should operate as if, understand the median voter in the Senate is going to be Angus King, who's an independent who caucuses with the Democrats, Joe Manchin, who's a Democrat but from West Virginia, won his last election with less than 50% of the vote. Both of them actually voted against the Green New Deal when Mitch McConnell gave them an opportunity to do that. Or Mark Kelly, a Democrat just elected to the Senate from Arizona by a 76,000 vote margin over Martha McSally. You just don't win statewide office in Arizona by not talking about jobs and industrial growth and so on, as opposed to more abstract things like climate. And so I think we have to be really cautious about this. We need to build a consensus for this, and that's going to be a long-term mission. But I think the reality is we're going to be using a lot of administrative action. We should try to do something big on legislation, and I guess, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't work. Administrative action, and then also the states. And I guess the last thing I'll say about this is since the election was called, I've been on, 15 or 20 calls with foreign governments. And I'm hearing a lot of concern. Everyone acknowledges that the United States is going to be back in Paris. That's going to happen on day one. But then people want to know what to believe. What does the United States doing that's credible? And that's where these state actions, although they may be more costly and have less leverage on the problem than an optimal federal policy, the state actions are going to play a big role. And some of the administrative actions are going to be really important as well. I'll just call out two. One is financial disclosure in the financial markets. The more capital starts moving and being attentive, in particular to physical risks, that's going to be very, very important and essentially irreversible. And the other is giving the states more power. The waiver that California has for air pollution regulations that it's using on light duty vehicles, if that's applied more widely, that could really help bake in a lot of action. So that's where I'm going to be focused in terms of the politics, is wanting the consensus, doing everything we can to help build a consensus, but focusing kind of like a laser on how do we boost the credibility of what the country says to the rest of the world, such that the rest of the world then does more and we do more and we build cooperation that way.
I happened to read, finally, Douglas Brinkley's very nice account of the moonshot that he wrote last year on the 50th anniversary of Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. And it's a lovely account of the politics as well as the sequence of Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo missions to get to the moon. And it is instructive for us Of course, Kennedy really, galvanized the nation with the moonshot. The Russians galvanized the nation with Sputnik and Gagarin, it was a race to the moon. But also, they were very clever in where they put a lot of the NASA facilities. NASA was a big ticket project over the 8.5 years from deciding on the moonshot to Apollo 11. And when they built it out, it ended up employing, it's estimated, 400,000 people, 20,000 private companies in one way or another involved. So a true public-private partnership. And a lot of it, I think probably most of it, distributed across the Southeast and the Southwest. So Huntsville, Alabama, or Mission Control in Houston, it very consciously, it was an industrial policy, of course, to build up aerospace, semiconductors, all of the huge inputs to the moonshot, and distributed them for some political reasons and some regional development reasons. And it had a lasting effect of creating great universities, new scientific areas of work, major companies, of course. And I think we should think in similar terms, some understanding and some politics involved in making sure that what is a pretty big ticket item also generates a lot of support across regions that right now may not feel much part of this effort, but could get quite engaged in it. And interestingly for me, and I think positively, 8 mayors of the Upper Appalachian region, led by Bill Peduto in Pittsburgh, and also connecting Morgantown, West Virginia, Cincinnati, Louisville, and others in the region, said, hey, look, we want to be part of this. We want an reindustrialization program, and we want it to be based on clean energy technology. And so that's a very interesting, already interesting regional group that says this is something that can work for us. And I think we need to try to build that out.
Let me pivot a bit from the politics to ask a question about the private sector and its role here. So, both of you have mentioned it. But recently, in the last few years, the private sector has been very active in climate-related technological innovation, including in financial instruments. And so how would you suggest that the Biden administration work with private actors for deep decarbonization? And one question in particular for David, touching on the issue of followership, is kind of what's the role of technology transfer and the role of IP in this leadership leading to followership dynamic that you raised?
Maybe I'll just say a word to start, which is there's going to be a lot of spending on energy no matter what we do, because if we were to continue on fossil fuels, that's a lot of spending. And if we move to renewables and electric vehicles and so forth, as we should, that's also many percent of GDP. It's got to be funded by markets, by banks, and so forth. To my mind, the single most important way to direct the capital in the right direction is not even the question of a carbon price and so forth, but it is clarity that we are really going to net zero. Some pioneers like Elon Musk, they said that's where we're going to go, and I'm going to build the best electric vehicle to get there. And now he owns a significant share of a modest-sized company that is higher market cap than just about all the major auto producers in the world combined. So he's really, already shown that he can bring in phenomenal amounts of capital based on the vision that we're all going to be driving electric vehicles. I'd like to find ways to make that commitment credible, because if it were really absolutely sure, not how we're going to do it, but that we're really going to get to net zero, our banks, which are still funding a lot of fossil fuel, would stop funding fossil fuel. But they would fund the alternatives because there's no doubt we're going to invest in energy. We need a lot of it, and there's going to be a lot of buyers of electricity, and they would fund the right kind in the end. So to my mind, the target is absolutely the single most important signal. If we could make it clear that it's a national consensus as part of a global consensus, that we're really doing this, that will drive a tremendous, tremendous amount of change. Entrepreneurship, private capital, venture capital, early stage capital, large bank funding that would shift out of the fossil fuels. Of course, there's a lot more that can be done. I would like to see a national infrastructure bank to essentially translate the low interest rates on US Treasury debt into funding for a significant part of this transformation, because I think, as David said, it's all about capital. So if we can get the interest rates low enough, it makes it possible to deploy a lot of renewables. And so these are the kinds of tools that we need to use. But to my mind, the confidence that we're really making this transformation will be the most important single driver.
Yeah, I'd say three things. First, exactly where Jeff ended. Firms have to know direction of travel, not the exact route, but direction of travel. And to me, the most important observation about what corporations are doing in terms of their pledges on net zero, deep cuts in emissions, is that the vast majority of them doing this are headquartered in Europe right now. And that's because if you're headquartered in Europe, you know direction of travel. If you're a big oil and gas company and you're in Europe, then you know that your business as you know it has to cease, and you have to do something different. And then you got to figure out, am I good at doing that? Am I good at putting carbon underground? Turns out they are. Am I good at moving gaseous molecules that might not be fossil methane, but something else through pipes? Turns out they are. And they work on the problem. And so that's first thing is I think you got to make it very clear. And the Biden administration will do that, although there's going to be a lot of chipping away and sniping and so on, and that'll reduce credibility. But a lot of the state actions will help in that regard. Second point I'd make is that it's very hard to talk about the climate problem in the abstract general way. You have to work sector by sector, because the innovation strategy you need, the border measures, the amount of subsidy, the support from, say, government procurement that you need, it varies if you're making green steel versus you're making green plastics versus green electricity, and on and on and on. So you have to break the big problem down into smaller units and work sector by sector. The thing to watch in the UK hosting of the COP26 is they're going to have these things called campaigns. They've got 5 of them, and that's exactly the logic behind the campaigns. Is they're going to be working in finance, they're going to be working in the electric power sector, they're going to be working in light duty vehicles, showing what small groups of firms and governments together can do to really move the needle. It's working sector by sector. And the last point that you teed up, Gordon, I think is critical, which is how do we make sure that these pioneering activities, as they spread to the United States, don't just get stuck in the pioneering parts of the world. I think there's a lot of fake debate about intellectual property. It's not that intellectual property doesn't matter, but it's one of those debates that gets everybody wrapped around the axle and makes it harder for people to focus on what the larger questions are. I think the developing countries right now are frankly a little skeptical that there's going to be the benefits of global cooperation on climate that they were promised, and so we're going to have to demonstrate credibility of that. That's going to be a big part of COP26. We have to remember that there are other factors in the global economy that are having right now a much bigger impact on the slowdown of the spread of technology, like this huge dispersion in the costs of capital. In the Western countries, cost of capital is almost zero. In a lot of the emerging economies, the cost of capital is extremely high, and that's before you figure in currency risk. And that's just overwhelms any concerns about intellectual property. So we're going to have to address that problem head on, and whether it's a global infrastructure bank Ken Rogoff and others have been working on, or other kinds of ideas. Frankly, the Belt and Road Initiative could be thought of as an infrastructure bank if we can get it greener. That's a big Chinese-led overseas investment program. And so I think that's going to be the way to make progress. But we just have to remember that these are going to be capital intensive technologies for the most part, and therefore getting serious about the real costs of capital, lowering them, de-risking, that's going to be the bread and butter of making progress here.
Great. Let me move on to a few questions from the audience in our last 15 minutes. And the first I'll throw out is, again, in the spirit of followership. What are your impressions of Governor Newsom's order to phase out all gas-powered vehicles by 2035? And what potential impact could this have on other states and the federal government? David, do you want to go first?
I think it's a good move. And the playbook is what they did they tried to do in the 90s. The technology was not ready, but the legal playbook is there. And I think you're going to see a whole lot of states follow. I do think the politics here are really hard, just to pick up on where Jeff was headed with the role of labor. We don't yet see in organized labor complete buy-in around the electric vehicle schemes. And that's why you see this dispersion in what Detroit is doing on EVs between notably Ford and GM, different strategies, different politics. The politics at the federal level around this are still going to be hard. So I think this is going to be state-led, and California is way out in front on this. You're going to see a lot of states follow.
Yeah, my guess is we will get to some kind of national milestone date like that. So definitely the administration knows that this is one of the central pillars of the incoming administration, that is. And many countries are adopting limits for the end of sales of emitting vehicles. So we'll find ourselves within a couple of years, and maybe even by Glasgow, find that this is itself a pretty large coalition that internal combustion engines are basically going to be phased out unless they can in some other way demonstrate that they're zero emission vehicles. So I don't think the governor is going to be alone on this. It's the right move, and 2035 is, I always say 2030. That's probably not the most realistic guess, but some countries are stopping sales in 2025. I think Denmark, if I remember correctly, but I may be wrong on that. But definitely many before 2035. And I think we're going to see that this is, as with power generation, a pretty straightforward kind of target to set. Of course, we have the politics of being a major auto producer, so all the internal politics that buyers alone don't have. But still, the notion that you set a date and a limit and you just phase out is the way to go.
So let me ask a question that will relate to that last point. So there's a question from the audience on negative emissions technologies and their role in all of this. And if the main thrust of the recommendations are regulatory as opposed to pricing carbon, then how do negative emissions technology fit into that story, and how are they incentivized?
Yeah, surely we're going to need, if it's a pure carbon capture and storage kind of opportunity, we're going to put a price on that, and it will be financed by some kind of phased in carbon levy. So we'll have some system. You won't need a lot of collection of taxes because we're not going to do a lot of CCS as the main way out of this. But from the point of view of carbon capture and storage from point source fossil fuel emitters, you need to give an incentive for that. And I think that needs to be built in. The other ways to get to net negative are some pure land transformation issues, which is what Gordon worked on principally in the project. So you might say some words about that also, Gordon. But we need to restore a lot of degraded lands. We need to afforest and reforest. There's a lot of natural carbon that would be very wise from many points of view, including biodiversity, ecosystem functions and net carbon balance to restore to biological storage. That might also probably does to some extent require a payment for the service of carbon storage as well. So we're going to have to come up with some of those positive incentives.
Go ahead, David.
Just very quick, I agree with that. Let me just say, right now the costs make you blanch. The cost for the machines to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere are high, but you got to start somewhere. And so there's a big option value in effect in the out decades of building some of these machines now and investing in a variety of other technologies and things that are less, high tech but still work, land restoration and so on. I want to just mention that we're starting to see funding mechanisms, very small, but the funding mechanisms are shifting. So Square, for example, the payment services company, now has a high quality carbon offset that you can buy that's expensive, but it actually buys part of one of these machines. And so you really know that what you're buying is a high quality reduction in emissions as opposed to some bunch of accounting tricks that frankly, a lot of people are using in the offsets market. So I think the financing mechanisms have been slow to pick up, but now that we see a demand for it, they're getting there.
Just to add in my 2 cents on the negative emissions on land, I think I agree with Jeff that for lots of things, you're going to have to compensate landowners for taking on costly activities that sequester more carbon. But there are a lot of things that can be directly financed by the government. For example, the acquisition of land for reforestation is easier than imagining a stream of payments to landowners. It's just easier for the federal government to purchase the land back and add it to the National Forest Service. And in terms of soil carbon, there's a lot of science that still needs to happen in measuring soil carbon and finding ways to increase it. So there's still a lot of R&D that needs to go in, and that should be publicly financed. So 2 roles for the government there, certainly, as well as large extension worker expansion. We need to hire thousands of agricultural extension workers to teach farmers to use cover crops better and to change modalities in ways that agriculture can sequester more carbon.
There is this idea, of course, of systematic large-scale net emissions through what's called BECCS, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. I doubt that there's that much that's going to happen in that particular domain. The idea is make biofuels, burn them, capture the CO2. It's both expensive directly to do that, but it's also quite expensive to turn over lots of farmland to bioenergy that you end up burning rather than end up eating or end up using for other eco-services. So I'm not persuaded for just that footnote, which became part of everybody's models for a little while. I don't think that we're going to go down that path at a large scale, most likely.
Yeah, and I know, Gordon, you want to get to another question, but we ought to not forget nature in this.
Yeah,
bioenergy solutions are just an ecological nightmare.
Exactly.
And we've got to leave nature for nature and find a way to reduce our footprint, which right now is a global footprint through carbon dioxide, and not end up, and this is going to be a challenge, I think, also for some of the big renewables plans, because they require substantial areas, and you got to pay attention to that. Otherwise, we're going to be so obsessed about climate, we're going to forget about the other things we care about.
The next question takes us back to the politics of this a little bit. So it's likely that Biden is going to receive a lot of political pressure from the left and the Green New Deal coalition, which is opposed by the National Labor Union leaders in lots of cases. And so there's going to be a tension between labor and environment within the Democratic tent. And so what's the path forward there, and what are examples perhaps where environment and labor interests have come together in the past?
It's industrial policy that Jeff mentioned. I think this is not your grandfather's industrial policy where people are kind of struggling to get it right. I mean, there'll be struggles and so on, but we've got to focus on how to actually make the kinds of investment decisions that generate local environmental benefits, that generate better jobs, and are seen credibly by organized labor and by the new left as part of that solution. I guess what I'd like to say is I think the old politics of the Democratic Party were heavily intersected with organized labor. The new politics of the Democratic Party are very heavily intersected with these other movements that have emerged through the progressive wing of the party. And we've seen this in Black Lives Matter. We've seen this in the concerns about inequality. And the old Democrats, to their peril, can misunderstand that. And I think that's navigating that, which was kind of carefully done during the general election. But now you're starting to see splinters coming apart. I think that's going to be crucially important to success here. I will say that there's the Green New Deal, which is the very large sticker price kind of vision. And then there's the process of the Green New Deal, where what you're doing is going and creating new industries, seeding experiments, learning quickly, changing facts on the ground, and so on. I think that's, whether we call it the Green New Deal or not the Green New Deal, that's the way of the future for cutting emissions that holds the left of the party together.
Yeah, just to add on that, I think a lot of this will depend on being more vivid and specific about what we're actually doing. For a long time, the debate was, do we have tradable permits or do we have a carbon tax? And the resounding political answer was neither, thank you very much. We don't want any of those fancy whatever it is. We'd rather have low-cost energy, thank you. And I think, in a way, it was just all too abstract to begin with. Not that there wasn't also tremendous vested interests involved in opposing such actions, but rather than talking about exactly which tool to use, I do believe that we need to talk about what this transformation looks like in the way we have been talking about it. What are we going to build? What's going to power our economy? What kind of cars are we going to drive? Where will the power plants be? It doesn't make it simple by any means, but I think it makes it less abstract and hypothetical that just brings people to barricades on either sides and says, yeah, that sounds like a better path to me. And I'm hoping that with that kind of vividness, we're going to get farther. And other countries that have grappled, less complicated than the United States, I would say, but Germany with its coal commission and so forth, had to get down to the real nitty gritty. Okay, how are we phasing out lignite and coal? How many years? What are the alternatives? What's going to happen to our neighborhood? Well, they finally hammered it out. And I think we're going to have to hammer some of these things out. It's not going to be a quick trick or a simple policy move. It's going to be enough people saying that's a better future to vote it through.
Great. I'm going to jump in here, Gordon. I want it's painful for me to do so because the conversation is fascinating, and I hate to bring it to an end, but unfortunately, we're at the end of our time here. I want to thank all of the speakers, Jeff, David, Gordon, for a fantastic and stimulating conversation on a topic that is important, and I only wish we had 3 more hours to talk.
We're going to have years to talk about it, Josh.
Yeah, that's true. We've been talking about it for years, and we'll continue to do so, sadly. I want to thank everybody who fed in questions. I apologize to those of you who we didn't get to, but in limited time, it's very difficult. Thank you for joining us this evening. I just want to remind you, this is one talk in a series of talks. We have some no formal dates on the schedule because we're penciling those out right now with our speakers, but we have more to come in the new year. And we look forward to seeing you at all of our events. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you to Jeff, David, and Gordon for a fantastic and stimulating conversation. And I look forward to seeing all of you, albeit probably virtually soon. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Josh.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.